Who She Was by Braley Parkinson. Prologue. Detroit, Michigan, Poor Brightmoor, July 2011. The scorching sun beat down upon a neighborhood filled with dilapidated homes and empty lots, where houses had been destroyed by fire, hidden within the depths of the west side of Detroit. Ali Mansu, the owner of the liquor store that also served as the primary market for the area, had just finished gathering all the trash within his establishment. With no functioning air conditioning, the scent of garbage from various bins had seeped into the aisleways. In a rush, he stepped outside with bags of trash in tow, but something abruptly caused him to stop and drop them. A stench rose from the rusty dumpster behind the liquor store. The smell was evidence enough for Ali Mansu to know that there was a dead body nearby. The store owner mumbled prayers to Allah as he felt the hairs on the back of his neck stand up. The hot, putrid smell of rotting flesh filled his nostrils, causing him to drop the bag of garbage and peer into the dumpster. A fearful glance revealed only bags of trash, but behind the dumpster, in a thicket of overgrown weeds, a pale, leathery hand lay outstretched, reaching towards the sky. The fingers, stiff with rigor mortis, were curved into a claw. Between overgrowth and debris, a pool of blood, blackened by the passage of hours, had formed beneath the perforated skull. Strands of wayward blonde hair drenched in blood were stuck to the cement. Even in the body's diminished condition, it was clear this woman did not belong to Detroit. The degraded hand showed signs of a recent manicure, and the large diamond dangling from her finger told a story that went beyond robbery. The shooter used 5 bullets. The first one would have done the job, but whoever had murdered this woman had been angry. Money hadn't been the motive. Ali's heart raced as he scampered towards the back door. As Ali sprinted back into the dimly lit store, he grabbed his phone and dialed 911 with a trembling hand. His voice shook as he described what he'd found and demanded that the police come immediately. The operator stayed on the line, providing reassurance and promising that help would be there soon. Ali could hardly breathe as he waited for the police to arrive, his mind racing with thoughts of the life he was so suddenly thrust into, a life now marred by violence and death. Sweat trickled down his face as he paced the shop, trying to process the gruesome scene he had witnessed. Despite the anxiety coursing through his veins, Ali couldn't help but wonder if he could have done anything to save the mysterious woman, or if it was simply better to leave such things to the professionals. Finally, the sound of sirens pierced through the air, announcing law enforcement's arrival. The overworked and underpaid detectives examined the scene and talked to Ali, but he had very little information to share. The store had only been open a couple of weeks, and he knew little about the neighborhood yet. The detectives took the store owner's statement, headed back to the alley, and waited for the medical examiner to show up. 1. This is what you get for being in the office on Christmas Eve, I thought, as I watched a car parallel park in front of my office. It was my 4th year of widowhood, but I still hadn't figured out how to have a successful holiday season at home. After spending the past few Christmases out of town, I'd convinced myself to stay home this year. Unfortunately, I'd overestimated the amount of business that would present itself in December, and most of my days had been spent organizing and filing paperwork. Now that it was Christmas Eve, a specific pang of loneliness throbbed in my throat. My husband, Derek, had been a Christmas fanatic. He'd start streaming lights around the edge of our house the day after Halloween. Every time I closed my eyes, memories of the warm, refreshing scent of pine, or the aroma of a huge, hot, bubbly piece of apple pie slipped into my thoughts. The sights, sounds, and smells of the season permeated my senses, even though I hadn't participated in any festivities since Derek's death. I had wonderful memories, but now being at home during the holidays meant facing a silent, empty homestead. That was why I was at the office, organizing receipts for tax season. To drive away the pangs of loneliness, I'd started the day with a shot of vodka. Normally, I stayed away from alcohol, but there were days when the bitter poison slowed my thoughts and helped me to forget. By 10 a.m., I was combing through mounds of receipts. After about an hour, I took a break and paced the office, noticing how loudly Martin, my brother-in-law assistant, was snoring at the adjacent desk. I poured myself another shot. Even though we had nothing on the books, Martin had decided to come to work. We were both there for unspoken comfort. I walked over to the picture window, drank the vodka down in one swig, and sat on the ledge. Michigan was playing its usual bipolar weather game. The previous week, a foot of snow had fallen, but now temperatures were in the low 40s, and a cold, unforgiving rain had been beating against the window for the better part of 3 days. I was staring at Michigan Avenue, admiring the stillness of the town below, when the car came whipping into view. I watched the sporty black Mazda 3 squeeze itself into the tiny space between Martin's Camry and an old rusted Bonneville. I smacked the bottom of Martin's hiking boot. "Look alive. Someone's coming up." "Huh. We have a client." "Where?" "On his way up." "How'd you know it's for us?" Martin asked, leaning back in the chair and attempting to return to his nap. "Because no one else in this building is stupid enough to be open." "Get up," I said, pushing the back of his chair to an upright position. "Gee, Sil," he said, scratching his head before sitting up straight. I tossed the bottle of vodka into the bottom desk drawer, pushed the receipts aside, and opened my laptop. A few seconds later, I buzzed the man into the office. He was drenched from head to toe. "Hello," I said, before holding out my hand and waiting as he pulled off his rain-soaked parka. He waved my hand away and gingerly hung the parka on the coat rack. When he looked up, I immediately recognized his face. "My name is Sylvia Wilcox. How may I help you?" Carson Stark was his name, and he'd been on the nightly news for months following his wife's untimely demise. He was just as lanky as he'd looked on television. About 6'4" and bald, with huge haunting blue eyes, and he had a long sharp nose that was slightly off-kilter, indicating that he had probably broken it at some point. The crow's feet in the corners of his eyes told me that he was older than he seemed, but his body was sleek and trim, like that of a long-distance runner. When he failed to respond or move, I decided to prompt him a second time. "Hello, I'm Sylvia Wilcox. What can I do for you?" I asked, stretching out my arm once again for a handshake. He gave my hand a gentle shake, headed towards the desk, and dropped into the chair next to Martin without any explanation. I took a quick mental inventory of the man. Carson Stark reeked of old money. The sporty but economical Mazda 3 reinforced the fact that he had nothing to prove to anyone. He'd always had money, and always would have it, so there was no need to be flashy. His creased brow was a direct result of his wife's murder, because this was a man who had been able to fix just about any problem that had come into his life. Losing his wife and not having answers was killing him. "You need a private investigator." He nodded, but didn't elaborate. After a long, uncomfortable pause, I said, "Start from the beginning." I sat down in front of my laptop, opened a new document, and cast a sideways glance at Martin, signaling that he should leave. Martin introduced himself and quickly disappeared into the tiny room next to the office, shutting the door behind him. During my brief stint as a private detective, I'd learned that it was better to do an initial consultation one-on-one. Clients were more apt to be candid if they were spilling their guts to a single person. "My wife," began Carson Stark, only to have emotion choke his throat closed. He dropped his head, his eyes shut tight. "My wife was murdered. I want to know what happened to her. The police have no leads, and they've interrogated me to the point of harassment. Now they aren't even really investigating the case. I have to know what happened." Tears welled in his eyes. I pulled out a box of tissues and pushed it towards him. "How long has it been?" I asked. 17 months. "Who do you think would do this?" "That's the thing, I don't know. She was a beautiful person, and I can't think of anyone who disliked her. She was a great mother, wife, and friend. The world was better when she was here." He couldn't think of anyone who would hurt his wife, but the reality was that someone had done more than hurt her. Someone had taken her life, and life-taking, although sometimes the random endeavor of a stranger, was more often a passion-riddled deed carried out by an acquaintance. "I will need more information before I decide if I can help." "What angles did the police share with you?" I asked. "The police think it was me, only they have no proof because it wasn't me. She was murdered on the west side of Detroit, and I have no idea why she would be there. Without GPS, I personally don't even know how to get to the spot where her body was found. Any other suspects? None that I know of, although there was speculation that she was having an affair. I remembered the story well. Carson Stark, a Northville Township doctor, had lost his wife to murder. She'd been shot in Brightmoor, an incredibly poor section of Detroit on the edge of Redford Township. I'd worked in the area patrolled by 8th Precinct, where the murder had taken place, before becoming a private detective. Most of my old colleagues thought that she had been having an affair with a drug dealer. I remember the story from the news. She was shot, right? Yes. Do you think she was having an affair? No. Do you have a photo of her? Of course. He dug into his jacket pocket and pulled out a small stack of pictures. He gazed lovingly at the photograph on top, before handing it to me. Liza Stark had been almost perfect. 5'6", about 35 years old, with soft aqua eyes that stared into the camera, and a well-practiced smile featuring her straight white teeth. Her strawberry blonde hair was pulled into a ponytail that cascaded down her back. She was posing next to a petite woman with beautiful sable-colored skin. They stood arm in arm, wide smiles on their faces. Both women were striking, but there was a hardness in Liza's otherwise pretty smile, something I couldn't quite put my finger on. Liza is the blonde, correct? Yes. Who is the other woman? Madeline Price. I thought it would be good for you to know what she looks like as well. Why is that? She was the last person to talk to Liza before she? They were supposed to meet for a coffee date, but Liza never showed up. Madeline waited for a while, but eventually left and called to let me know that Liza had stood her up. Do you suspect that Madeline Price had something to do with the murder? Oh no. I just thought you might want to talk to her. She and Liza were best friends. Yes? I will definitely need to talk with her. I'm very sorry you lost your wife, I said, handing the photo back to Mr. Stark. He didn't reach out to take it. Can you help me? Good question. Murder is hard to solve, even when you have an organized police force on your side. I was a one-woman agency with a law school dropout assistant. The case was too big for me, and I'd promised myself that homicide was off the list for my agency. Mr. Stark, I want to help, but I have a small operation here and I don't really take homicide cases. I have. You've lost a spouse and it changed your life. You know what it's like. I pushed the laptop aside and stared at Carson Stark. He had investigated me. That was common, but people usually wanted to know about my credentials, not my personal life. Don't be alarmed. You come highly recommended. An officer in Detroit greatly admires you. He told me your story and why you left the police force. Said you couldn't take not knowing. That you fought until you solved cases. Made you unpopular amongst the other officers. He also told me you have a master's degree in criminology, near the top of your class. I didn't know whether to be impressed, or if I needed to contemplate filing a personal protection order. Well, I guess you've done your homework. I assume that means you also know that all those highfalutin tricks that fictitious PIs use will land me in jail. Once I turned in the badge, I turned back into a citizen. Private investigating isn't as glamorous or as fun as it looks. Intuition, feelings, and what people say guide the way. Sometimes the police are helpful, but other times they're offended by the intrusion of an outside entity. That's the thing. Whatever happened to Liza won't be discovered through a traditional police investigation. I need someone who can feel and discern the small details. You have to be able to see things that aren't seen by the typical police officer's eye. I had lost a spouse under mysterious circumstances. The truth had been hard to find, but I hadn't stopped searching until I knew exactly what had happened. I'd worked diligently to uncover the truth. It was an ugly truth, but it's always better to know what happened. Even when it's a dirty secret you never speak of to anyone else, you feel better knowing. But this case was too much for me. The reminder that spouses are sometimes unjustly taken away, the idea that there was a selfish killer out there that needed to be caught, it would be too much for me. I would get caught up in the case and lose myself. But I had a yearning for justice, and Carson Stark deserved that. The case had fallen away from the active roster at the precinct. Liza Stark had been written off as a cheater who had gotten what she deserved. But she deserved better, her husband deserved better. Okay, Mr. Stark. I'll do my best. Please find the person who did this to her. They left my children motherless and me. I'm sorry for your loss, I said again, before giving him a few moments to regain his composure. Once the lines in his brow eased, I began a battery of questions. Let's start with that morning. Did anything out of the ordinary happen? She was herself, nothing out of the ordinary. A bit flustered with the kids perhaps, but that had been the case for a while. Isabel was 2 and Shane was 3 at the time. We just hired a housekeeper and part-time nanny to help. Was this something new? It had been going on for a few weeks. The kids are 17 months apart. I think Liza was just exhausted from the stress of the previous 4 years. It was hard for me to be there, as much as I wanted to be. I had only been at the hospital a few months, and the workload was much heavier than it was at my previous assignment. That's why I suggested that we get her some help. When was the nanny scheduled to leave that day? 7 p.m. Neither of our kids have ever napped much, so they go to bed early. The nanny was originally scheduled to work a few hours a day, but by that time, she was working from 1 to 7 p.m., 5 days a week. Tell me about the hours that led up to your departure for work. Any details, regardless of how small, might be helpful. We bathed and played with the kids. After that, we headed for lunch and spent time at a park. Liza told me she was going to run errands, get a manicure, and meet a friend for coffee. So the nanny was there to watch the kids while Liza ran errands? Yes. She was originally just going to do housekeeping for us, but she really clicked with the kids. And Liza needed more time to herself. Having 2 toddlers is stressful, so it made sense that Liza needed a break, but it also brought up questions about what she did during those breaks. Do you think Liza ended up in Brightmoor of her own accord? I don't think so, but she was driving and her car was found unscathed. That makes me think she had to have driven there herself, which leaves me with more questions. I don't know, maybe she got lost or something, but there really is no excuse for her to have been there. Interesting way to phrase the explanation. A good reason didn't have to be present. Sometimes people are irrational and sometimes people have secrets. Brightmoor was a wasteland of firebombed houses, drug houses, and party stores. There wasn't really a good reason for non-residents to be in the area. Liza was meeting a friend, Madeline, correct? Yes, Madeline Price, her best friend. The other woman in the photo. Did Liza make it for coffee? No, but she called Madeline and told her she was running late. That was around 3 p.m. She sent another text message around 20 past 4. That was the last activity on her cell phone. Is Madeline in Northville too? No. She lives in Ann Arbor, not too far from here. Do you know where they were meeting? No. At the time it didn't seem important. I'll need her information. Carson nodded and an awkward pause filled the office. I wasn't sure where to start with this case. I hoped it wasn't an infidelity case gone wrong, but from what I was hearing, the possibility was there. Most of my work came from former trophy wives turned soccer moms, who wanted proof of infidelity so that they could get a sizable divorce settlement. Men are notoriously bad cheaters, so those cases were always simple and fast. But women who cheated on their husbands, those cases could be tough, and solving a murder that took place in a city that vies for the murder capital of the country on a yearly basis was an entirely different story. Does Liza have family in the area? Yes. I waited, but nothing came. May I have their names? I'd rather leave them out of it. That's not possible. If you want me to take the case, I need all the information. Things might get uncomfortable. If you don't want that, we can't move forward. A pained look came across his face. Murder can drive a serious wedge between family members, but there was no getting around talking with them. Mr. Stark, I understand how hard this must be for everyone involved, but I will need to talk with Liza's family. Did she have any siblings? Are her parents alive and in the area? Liza has a brother, Peter Abernathy, but they weren't close. I doubt he'd know anything. Her parents, Ralph and Janice Abernathy, live in Livonia, but we rarely saw them. I paused and allowed Carson to rattle on about the insignificance of Liza's family. The curious thing about marriage is that it provides a false sense of familiarity. You live, eat, and sleep with your spouse. The repetition of seeing that person every day creates the fabrication that you know them better than anyone else, and maybe you do, but then again, maybe you don't. I would still like to speak to Liza's brother and parents, just to be thorough. May I have contact information for Peter, Madeline, and Mrs. and Mr. Abernathy? I asked, forcing a smile that I hoped was reassuring. Carson continued the unbroken eye contact. A few silent, motionless minutes passed before he pulled out his phone. His pupils were faded and coarse, like blue jeans that had been washed too often. His movements were rigid, but stealthy for a man of his height, calculated and mechanical. He gave me the information and slipped back into that blank stare. I could almost hear the wheels in his head turning. Do you need money now? Mr. Stark asked. Just the retainer. You can transfer the money online when you get a chance. We shook hands and I walked him out, informing him that I'd be in touch when I had information to share. After that, I gently closed the door and took a moment to compose myself. The past bubbled up in my soul. Losing a spouse was one thing, but losing a spouse and having no idea why they were gone was unbearable. The feeling was all too familiar. I shook off the thought and called Marty into the office. We've got a case. Yes? Don't get too excited. We're in over our heads. 2. We closed up at 6 that evening. I pulled a gift-wrapped box out of my desk drawer and handed it to Marty before turning out the lights. Syl, you didn't have to get me anything. Don't make a big deal. It's Christmas, for goodness sake. Everybody needs a gift. I watched him blush. Let's get out of here. You got plans? Midnight Mass is on tap if you're free. I said, grabbing my umbrella. I do have plans, but thanks. Probably a lie, but I let it go. As we headed out down the narrow staircase, Martin fired off a series of questions about Carson Stark. Do you think he did it? What do you think the cops will say about you taking the case? What do you want me to do? At the bottom of the staircase, I turned to face him, remaining silent. My first inclination was to snap and tell him to settle down, but then I remembered how much I owed him. He had given me a purpose, and for that, I was eternally grateful. I adjusted my features, softening my hardened frown. Recognizing the look that said, "Slow down, pace yourself," Martin nodded gently. I unfurled my umbrella and opened it before stepping out into the rain. Want a ride? Martin asked. No thanks. I'll walk. Sylvia, it's a downpour out here. I know. That's why I want to walk. Merry Christmas. I blew him a kiss and headed for the crosswalk. Living 5 blocks from the office made it nearly impossible to drive, even when the weather was miserable. As Martin pulled away, the chilled rain began to turn into sleet, and the slosh of my boots in the cold puddles increased my feelings of loneliness and regret. The meeting with Carson Stark had pushed me deeper into a somber mood. There's something depressing about spending the holiday alone in a place where you should know people. The opposite is true of out-of-town Christmas vacations, and I wondered again why I hadn't booked a flight. I'd spent the previous Christmas in Quebec City, sipping ice wine and nibbling on poutine in a cozy bed and breakfast. I'd spent a week in the old section of the city, making temporary friends of random strangers and meandering along the frigid, snow-covered cobblestone streets. The companionship of the strangers I met was too short to sour, but long enough to satiate the need for human contact. I'd returned after New Year's Day feeling refreshed and ready to get back to my world of all work and no play. I was born and raised in Detroit, and had spent most of my life in southeastern Michigan. My parents, who still lived in Detroit, tolerated yearly visits, but we had not been close for a long time. At 10 years old, my twin brother Simon had disappeared one day when we were playing at the edge of the dead-end street adjacent to our house. The loss of Simon had destroyed our family, causing me to seek refuge somewhere far away from my parents. I'd attended a boarding school in Connecticut as a teenager, but something had drawn me back to Michigan for college. Ironically, Michigan is the place where I feel most alone. My haunted past had followed me around the state, with the ghost seemingly incapable of leaving Michigan. During my time in Connecticut, I'd been free of the guilt of being the twin that hadn't been abducted, but returning to Michigan had rekindled painful memories of my brother's absence. Currently, I live in Ypsilanti, Michigan, a little college town about 40 minutes from Detroit. Ypsilanti is historic district meets the ghetto, with a crosshatch of college life. The town is sandwiched in between Ann Arbor and Superior Township in Washtenaw County, and it serves as a cheaper option for those who want to live close to the culture and beauty of the Ann Arbor area. I moved to Ypsi for graduate school and fell in love with the place. It has a Midwest swagger with a hint of Southern hospitality and an edge of danger. If you get a flat tire, someone will stop and help you change it, but if you leave your front door unlocked, someone might come in and maybe take a thing or two. People speak to each other when walking down the street, and hippies, scholars, students, and drug dealers manage to commingle without much friction. Shuddering underneath the umbrella, I felt the chill of isolation. The street was quiet and calm, but the glow of windows warm with Christmas Eve cheer filled my peripheral vision. I should have invited Martin over for a drink, but there was a part of me that didn't want company. The loss of Derek reminded me that some parts of life were dark. There was no way to eliminate them. Accepting that fact had helped me deal with the sorrow. Instead of thinking it would end, or that I needed to fight against the pain, I accepted that most days would be no better or worse than the previous day. Derek would always be in the corner of my mind, silent but ever present. I have learned that staying busy and productive is a great way to repress loneliness, but there are times when busyness fails to distract from the truth. Even so, I was going to do my best to let this new case consume me. As I stuck my key in the front door, I began to organize a plan of action to find out who killed Liza Stark. I headed to the kitchen and tossed half a box of linguine into a pot. In a second pot, I mixed Parmesan and cream cheese to make a simple but adequate Alfredo sauce. I poured myself a glass of Riesling, tossed the pasta and sauce together, and sat down at the long wooden table for a silent dinner. After that, I sighed and faced reality. The night was not over yet, so I had better start getting myself in order. Midnight Mass was the last place I wanted to go, but since it was Christmas Eve, it would be a stop along my lonely Christmas journey. There is nothing quite like midnight Mass, but you don't remember that until you walk through the door of the church. The inclination to curl up with hot cocoa and watch It's a Wonderful Life always tempts me to stay home, but once I arrive at church, I remember why I go every year. I'm drawn by the smell of frankincense and myrrh weaving through the air, the flickering flames of candles lit in oblation, and the collective warmth of the people in the overcrowded church, many of whom have not been to Mass since Easter or the previous Christmas Eve. I never want to go until I get there, but I never acknowledge that truth until I arrive. I took a shower before slipping on a cardigan, a long pleated black skirt and boots. As I waited for the clock to move closer to midnight, I started to review the preliminary questions that preface all murder investigations. Who wanted Liza Stark dead? Who had the means to kill her? How did she end up in a vulnerable position that allowed her to be killed? The issue of who wanted Liza Stark dead was important, but not as important as how she ended up being vulnerable to murder. Some people aren't likable, or they make enemies along the way. There might be a few people who would like to see them dead, but very few enemies are going to act on that impulse. Also, a complete and total stranger can kill you if you end up in the wrong place at the wrong time, so there was a chance that Liza's murder was purely coincidental. She was in one of the worst neighborhoods in the country. Getting murdered in Brightmoor was easy, but being in Brightmoor was not. So the first question was, how did she end up in a time and place that allowed her to be killed? Since it was Christmas Eve, there was little research that could be done. I wrote my 3 essential questions on a piece of paper, took it to my home office, placed it on the desk, and forced myself to close the door. Life is more than work, I told myself. The snow continued to fall throughout the evening. At 11:45, I reluctantly headed out into the bitter, wet cold. I arrived at the church moments before the procession started. Just about every seat was taken, and the air was full of incense. Warmth emitted from the packed pews. I slithered into a small space on one of the back pews, next to a family of 6. The toddler was bouncing on his mother's knee and squealing with delight. I flipped down the kneeler and said a few prayers before the music for the procession started. Christmas Day dawned with a cold, empty silence that left me distracted and aloof. A light, wispy snow was falling, and the temperature continued to drop throughout the day. I skipped my run that morning and curled up on the couch with a cup of tea. I spent the day alternating between my bed and the tattered beige recliner in the sitting room. My breakfast and lunch consisted of soup I'd made from my Thanksgiving turkey. In the evening, I felt restless and decided to find a movie to watch. After 30 minutes of a sappy story about international house swapping and falling in love, I stole one last look at Jude Law and turned off the television. Time to do something constructive. Being a pie is difficult because you're in law enforcement, but you don't have the perks that regular cops do. I have access to public domain information on the internet, but I can't just tap into a database and pull up interesting tidbits about a victim. Instead, I must find evidence the old-fashioned and least reliable way, by talking to people. I didn't think anyone would appreciate me interrupting their Christmas dinner to ask questions about a homicide, so I decided to do the cyber sleuth thing. The first question about the case was, what the hell was Liza Stark doing in Detroit? Southeastern Michigan living has 2 very simple rules: know your place and stay there. Liza Stark was a white female from the suburbs, and not one of the blue-collar United Auto Workers suburbs. There was really no legitimate reason for her to have been in the Brightmoor district of Detroit. There aren't many businesses in that area except for churches and liquor stores, and even those are sparse. It's a safe assumption that people who live in Brightmoor stay in the area and rarely, if ever, venture out of the neighborhood. Someone living in Brightmoor wouldn't end up in Northville Township, an upper-middle-class suburb that is light years away from most neighborhoods in Detroit. Someone living in Northville Township might end up in Brightmoor if they were searching for something they had trouble getting in their neighborhood. Even so, they would have to know someone in Brightmoor. Who did Liza know in that area? How would she have met them? Initially, I thought that drugs might have beckoned Liza below 8 Mile Road, but an article posted a few months after her killing said that an autopsy showed she didn't have any drugs in her system. Carson Stark had already told me about the second theory. Liza was a desperate housewife looking for a thrill with some young have-not. The third one, of course, was that Carson himself had murdered his wife. None of these theories really pushed the right buttons for me, but I thought that the infidelity angle was worth looking at. It is possible to be madly in love with someone who likes you enough to stay, but who has no problem lying to you. The tears and anguish Carson Stark had showed had seemed real, but who was to say that the Liza he knew was the only one that had existed? Maybe there was some drug-dealing, stolen car-wheeling guy who had satisfied Liza's primal urges. Since becoming a private detective, the bulk of my work had been focused on infidelity cases. Humans are capable of a high level of deceit. Liza could have gotten herself into a deadly affair. Perhaps her lower-class beau had demanded money, and she had refused. Before the night was over, I had some basic facts about Liza. She'd attended Stevenson High in Livonia, but no graduation date was listed. She'd also spent 2 years at Schoolcraft College, but never completed a degree or certificate. At the time of her murder, she was 34 years old and a stay-at-home mom. By all accounts, just your average suburban wife. Her life, before marrying Carson was a little less certain. Her work record was spotty. She'd been a certified nursing assistant for a while, and a substitute teacher, but neither career had lasted long. She'd taken classes in early education in college, but they hadn't amounted to much. Some people take time off between high school and college for jobs or to travel, but Liza did not seem to be a part of the working world until she was 22. That seemed odd, but not completely out of the question. Some people are slackers. I ran Liza's name through the online white pages and found addresses in Livonia, New Orleans, Louisiana, Northville, and Detroit. The dates indicated that she had lived in Livonia as a child, in Detroit as a teenager, and in Louisiana and Northville during her adult life. It was strange that she'd lived in Detroit at all, and it was even odder that she'd lived there as a teenager, but virtual white pages are notoriously inaccurate. The listing probably had another woman with the same name mixed in with Liza's address results. I also checked Liza's social media pages, but there wasn't much to see. Perhaps she had made sure to keep the security on her social media pages tight, and strangers were not able to view the bulk of her information. I couldn't be sure, but her list of friends was rather sparse. Her page had a picture of Carson and the kids, minus herself, and she had 29 friends. She hadn't posted anything since 2009, 2 years before she was murdered. Of course, social media had just been picking up steam around that time, so it wasn't too strange that she didn't have much information, but it did pique my interest. Posting on social media and having friends is by no means a sign of normalcy, but for a stay-at-home mom in a posh suburb, it would be a great place to boast and possibly brag about your world. She was beautiful, married to a doctor, had 2 kids, a phenomenal zip code, all the surface things that people think produce happiness. Of course, I know from experience that the more people you include in your life, the more difficult it is to be happy. Perhaps Liza had come to a similar conclusion and decided to keep her life private. Or maybe she'd turned to an outside source for some type of release. I scrolled through the few posts on Liza's page and found minimal, very guarded information. There were no thuggish-looking folks on her friends list. Next, I checked a newspaper website for articles on the murder. I read a short summary of the crime, and read a few statements from one of the detectives on the case, Kelvin Cole. After a few hours of scouring the internet, my vision was blurred from too much time in front of the computer. I closed the laptop, grabbed my phone, and called Martin. "She was hiding something," I said as soon as he picked up the phone. "Why do you think that?" "Oh, and Merry Christmas," Martin said. I could hear the muffled sound of a video game in the background. Her social media pages are sparse. There's one single solitary photo of her, the rest are of her family, but none of those photos have her in them. She's never with the family because she's different. How's she different? I don't know, but she's different from them. The noise in the background stopped. Tomorrow, I will set up appointments with Carson, her best friend Madeline, and the store owner. I want to see where Liza lived. After the holiday break, contact her former co-workers. She taught at St. Bart's for a year. Talk to the principal and any teachers who worked with her. I'll also call the 8th precinct and get in there to see the case file. "You think that Liza did something to get herself killed?" Martin asked. "I think that there's something her husband doesn't know that contributed to her murder. I know how it is to have secrets." 3. The day after Christmas, I woke up feeling restless, but one glance outside revealed slick, glistening sidewalks. Damn ice. I'd hoped to get out of the house early and get the adrenaline going, but running on ice was impossible. Instead, I decided to work the phones. The goal was to set up appointments with Madeline Price, the friend, Peter Abernathy, the brother, and the owner of the liquor store where Liza's body was found. I tried Madeline Price first. A soft, calm voice informed me that I'd reached Madeline before the message provided several options. Press 1 for information on yoga classes, 2 for mental health services, and 3 for personal inquiries. I pressed 3 and left my name, the reason for my call, and my number on the voice service. Next, I called Peter Abernathy and got his voicemail. His voice sounded angry and rushed, but he'd managed to contain himself and record a relatively professional-sounding message. The only person I managed to get a hold of was the liquor store owner, Ali Mansu. The phone rang twice before someone picked up and said, "Lo. May I speak to Mr. Ali Mansu?" "This is him." "Hello. My name is Sylvia Wilcox. I am a private detective investigating the murder of Liza Stark, and I would like to come in to talk with you about the murder." There was silence on the line. "Mr. Mansu?" "Yes. I am. I don't want nothing to do with that. Long time ago, and I already talked to police about it," the man shouted, his Middle Eastern accent thick and heavy. "Mr. Mansu, I understand. I just need a little bit of—" "No. Mr. Mansu. No, no, no. Sir, what would happen if the DPD came in and checked your employee roster?" Silence. "What if undercover cops were in your store, waiting for a minor to buy alcohol?" I hated to be one of those PIs, but sometimes you have to pull the police card. "Fine. What you want to know?" "I'd like to come by and talk with you." "That it?" "Yes." "Not a bunch of cops?" "No. Just me." "Oh. Okay." His voice was calm now. "That is okay. I thought you want to bring a lot of cops." "Nope. It's best that it's just you and I." "When?" "Today. Around noon." "Fine," he said before hanging up. I showered dressed in a blue pinstripe suit and dark blue pumps, and headed out. Pushing the Taurus just a few miles per hour over the speed limit, I was able to hit I-96 at 11:11 a.m. During the drive, I gave the scene a mental comb-over. Strangers in a strange part of town had found the body. Even though a multitude of murders had occurred in that area, and gunfire was a daily part of life, Liza's murder was unique. She didn't look like typical Brightmoor fare. That corner of the city had little diversity, but the inhabitants had a look. Deep bags under their eyes, faded faces, slow shuffling walks, and bovine gazes that told a story of hopelessness. If Liza Stark had been slumming it for a piece on the side, someone would have noticed her shiny red Range Rover cruising around. Traffic was relatively light at this time of day, and I was able to cruise to Brightmoor with ease. Passing through Redford Township, I was reminded of the home Derek and I had shared north of Telegraph Road. There was a time when Detroit cops were required to live within the city's boundaries, but by the time we were in DPD, that restriction had been dropped. Even so, we had decided to move into a section of the city where a bunch of retired cops and old-timers who were still on the force lived. Our little neighborhood on the outskirts of the city had been full of cops and other civil servants who needed a Detroit address, but wanted to be as close to the border as possible. Quiet, well-kept lawns lined streets of modest two-story brick bungalows and ramblers. Children played in carefully laid-out streets. The diversity lacking in most of Detroit lived within the 5 blocks preceding the working-class suburb of Redford. A few mom-and-pop businesses had survived the explosion of shopping malls and corporate fast food chains, making the neighborhood a hidden jewel of community and safety. We were well armed, and all the thugs on the other side of Telegraph Road knew it. There was little reason to venture across Telegraph Road except for work, but I had driven past the area where Liza's body was found countless times during my time on the force. Even though the murder had taken place over 2 years ago, and all physical evidence was long gone, talking to the store owner who had found the body still might be fruitful. I pulled up in front of the store at around 10 o'clock that morning. The sign on the storefront read simply, "Beer, Wine, Liquor." The corner store served as the one-stop grocery store, convenience store, and anything else you might need store. It was larger than average, but it carried with it the telltale signs of most neighborhood joints. Once inside the door, I spotted expired food lining the shelves, miscellaneous rotting fruit hanging off the front counter, and greasy processed pizza, chicken, and hamburgers filling the stands close to the checkout window. A thick plate of bulletproof glass separated the clerk from the patrons, and the butt of a shotgun could be seen just underneath the counter, just your typical Detroit party store. Ali Mansu wore a knitted cap on his balding head, and a cream-colored traditional robe. His smile, thin and forced, was clear even though he was behind the thick sheet of plexiglass. We'd made eye contact the moment I pushed open the heavy glass door. He gave a small wave, completed a transaction, and dropped a handful of change into the shallow silver well. He called for a young woman in a hijab who was stocking shelves in the food aisle. She looked up, nodded, smiled at me, and headed behind the counter. "Mr. Mansu? Mrs. Wilcox?" His eyes brightened with a mixture of fear and curiosity. "Yes, hello. Sylvia Wilcox," I said, holding out my hand and receiving a firm handshake in return from Allie. "Mrs. Wilcox, nice to meet you. We can talk in the storage room," Allie said, unlocking the cage that separated the cash register from the store. Allie was close to 6 feet tall, but he walked with a stoop, which caused him to look slightly slumped over. His face was encased in a thick black beard that was neatly cropped 2 or 3 inches from his chin. "Thanks for taking the time to meet with me," I said. "No problem," Allie said in a soft tone. I followed him down a tiny hallway that emptied into a room full of flattened boxes and random stock. He motioned for me to sit on a rusty gray, folding chair. "So, you had only been open a short time before you found the body, correct?" I asked. The rickety folding chair wobbled a bit. I said a silent prayer that it would last the length of the interview. "Yes. We had been open few weeks only," Allie said with a heavy accent. "Now you've been open for about 2 years, right?" "Correct, close to 2 years. Did you know that this was gang territory, and a very bad neighborhood when you opened the store?" "I grew up in Gaza. I'm not afraid of bad areas." "Would you say that you have the same customers over and over again?" I knew he did, but I wanted to prime him for the next question. Allie shook his head, yes. He was starting to look bored. "I know it will be hard to remember, but did anything out of the ordinary happen the day before you found Liza's body? Was it busy?" "My 4th son was born," Allie said. A smile spread across his face. "Congratulations," I said. If Allie's son had been born the day before Liza's body was dumped, he would remember the day better than if nothing important had happened in his life. This interview might net good information. I was in the store behind the counter when my wife called. I jumped up and down, told customers I had to close early, and left around 8 that night. "Were there people in the store when you found out?" "Yes, but I don't remember them. I was too excited about my son." Some customers would have known that the store closed early that night. They could have spread the word. "Is there anything else you remember about that night?" "I was leaving around 8, but ended up staying an extra few minutes because a customer showed up. She was mad because I was closing early. I asked her if it was an emergency. She said no, and after I explained why I was closing early, she understood." "Do you know the woman's name?" "Ah, yes. She is a regular. Very nice. Lives around the corner. Nice house. Nice husband. May I have her name?" "Amber. Amber Dukes, I think is her name. Nice house. You can't miss it." "Thanks. That's helpful. Do you remember posting a sign or anything like that to let people know that the store was closing early?" "No. I didn't want everyone to know, just those who came into the store. Letting the entire neighborhood know would not be smart. If someone stopped by and saw that the store was closed, it would be better for them to think that it was out of business than for me to tell everybody I was closing early." He had a good point. Broadcasting that he was closing early would have been an invitation for robbery. So, the only people who knew were customers who came into the store that day. Allie nodded. That meant that the killer had probably been in the store. "Do you have surveillance tapes?" "Of course. The police took them. I'd have to check with the detective who'd worked the case to see if any evidence had been garnered from the tapes." "Mr. Mansu, is there anything else you remember?" "The police didn't seem interested, but you might care." "I do care." "What weren't they interested in?" "The first few weeks the store was open, gangs bothered us. That's why we have the gun." After that lady was found dead in the alley, no more gangs bothered us. That was interesting. Perhaps Liza had been slumming it after all. What were the gangs doing? Breaking windows, graffiti, harassing my daughter. And that stopped after the body was found? Yes. Strange. May I see the alley? I asked. Sure. I followed Allie to the back of the storeroom, dodging cardboard. I will wait in the door. I don't want to leave a woman in the alley by herself. I nodded and headed out into the alley. A pale brown rusted-out dumpster sat in the midst of trash and overgrown grass. The alley was lined with abandoned buildings. It was a great place to dump a body. I tried to imagine a scenario that would end with Liza's body behind the dumpster. Why would she have been in this alley? Mrs. Wilcox, Allie called from the doorway. Will you be much longer? I'd come back later if I needed to. No. In fact, I'm all done. Thanks for your time. We headed back inside. I bought a pack of gum from Allie, waved goodbye, and left the store. On my way out, some unpleasant kids in gang colors pushed past me. 3 loud, boyish-looking girls with cornrows, bandanas, and saggy jeans muttered a litany of swear words as they rambled up and down the aisles. 2 of the girls were tall and thin, but the third one, a short, chunky girl, appeared to be their leader. I tried to avoid eye contact, but Chunky Girl fought to lock eyes with me. She was no more than 14, maybe 15 years old, but her face was already hardened from the wear and tear of life. Her forehead bore several lines of wrinkles, and her eyes were a dirty sea-green color that made me think of a contaminated ocean. I nodded and pushed past the girls. Outside, a skeleton-like body was lurching around on the passenger side of the Taurus. I ran my hand over the butt of my gun and made sure my shoes clicked loudly on the pavement. Hopefully, the being would scramble away as he heard me approaching. When I got within 4 feet, the emaciated body began to slowly pivot to face me. The remnants of breasts lay flat on her stomach, and a white film encircled the woman's mouth. When she tried to speak, the hole in her face produced a hollow pink and black pathway that croaked, "Spare change," in a raspy voice. I took my hand off the butt of the gun, dug into my pocket, and produced a piece of lint and 2 quarters. I dropped them in her hand and muttered, "May God have mercy." On my way back to the freeway, I decided to drive past the house of Amber, the woman who had come into the store the night Ali Mansu had closed early. Nice houses in Brightmoor are noticeable because they are the extreme exception. I drove down Da Costa Street and immediately recognized what had to be Amber's house. A modest but well-kept brick home sat behind a gated fence. I checked my phone for the time and surveyed the neighborhood. Impromptu interviews aren't ideal, but I wanted to at least get a look at the landscape. I looked up and down the block of burned-out houses. I assumed that some of them had been firebombed in drug turf wars. What I assumed to be Amber Duke's house sat behind a chain-link fence that had freshly shoveled sidewalks and a spattering of salt on the stairs leading to a tiny uncovered porch. I got out and walked along the street in front of the house. A worn welcome doormat that was caked with gray snow and salt sat on the porch. There was a "Beware of Dog" sign on the chain-link gate, and to back up this warning, 2 large Rottweilers ran around the side of the house with gusto, barking and making their presence known. I jotted down the address and headed back to the car. That afternoon, I headed back to the office and did some research on what had been going on in Brightmoor over the past few years. Since my departure from the police force, the neighborhood had shown some sparks of hope. One man had taken to driving around and scaring off people who came to dump trash or use the services of prostitutes in the area. Other residents had started community gardens and neighborhood watch groups. Even so, Brightmoor was by far one of the most dangerous areas in the city. By 5 that evening, my eyes were starting to blur. I closed the laptop and called Carson Stark. "Did you find something already?" he asked. "I'm working on gathering information. Actually, I would like to stop by your house and get a feel for the place Liza called home. She hasn't been there for quite some time." "What good will that do?" "It's routine. I just want to get a better feel for who Liza was. I also can update you on what I've learned so far." Dangling the carrot of information helped change Carson's mind. Okay. I'm working midnights this week, so if you can come sometime in the morning, that would be great. How about 10 tomorrow morning? Perfect. See you then. The next morning, I was in front of Carson's house by 9:55. Carson Stark lived in the new part of Northville Township. Oversized mansions that showcased the excesses of the current millennium, but none of the charm of the previous century, filled subdivision after subdivision. The Starks' home was a sprawling structure close to a state park. Carson met me at the side door that opened into the kitchen. He wore a tight smirk as he nodded hello. I stepped onto dark hardwood floors that sparkled with perfection. A matching polished wooden table had place settings ready for 4 occupants to settle into the cloth-backed beige chairs. A little girl with wispy blonde hair muttered a shy hi, and held her brother's hand up to wave at me. Mrs. Wilcox, thank you for coming. Welcome. We shook hands. A quick look around the house told me 2 things. Liza had picked the location, but Carson was responsible for the interior decoration. The interior of the house had an old-world charm. The exterior was identical to the rest of the houses in the area. Carson was dressed in black, creased slacks and a long-sleeved white button-down shirt with a blazer. His clothes had a modest quality that once again pointed to the fact that he was old money. He looked like he was on the way to a business meeting. Of course, the purpose of our meeting was business, but I was a little stunned at his formal dress. Hi, Mr. Stark. Hi there, I said, flapping my hand at the 2 children at the table. Hi, the little girl said again, smiling. Please call me Carson. Amelia? Carson called and turned towards the foyer. Can you take the kids? A small brown-skinned woman came into the kitchen, muttering in Spanish. Carson responded in Spanish as she gathered the children and left the room. The nanny housekeeper Carson had told me about, was she keeping any of Liza's secrets? Perhaps she had some information on why Liza was in Brightmoor the day she was murdered. I would have to talk to her before I left. She's our housekeeper and lifesaver. I don't think I could handle the kids without her, so glad Liza found her before. He sighed and ran a hand over his bald head. Accepting the loss of a spouse was a continuous process. It was the afterthoughts that reminded you that yes, they were really gone. I recognized that faraway, distracted look only too well. Mr. Stark, I said, trying to bring him back to the present, I have been trying to reconstruct Liza's life. When someone is shot as many times as she was, the perpetrator is usually someone they know. With that in mind, I need to know what Liza did with her free time and who her friends and family were. I need to know who Liza was. Carson was standing a few feet in front of me. His eyes were downcast and his forehead was wrinkled with worry lines. I imagined his mind was dissecting everything I said. After waiting for a response that never came, I tried to figure out how much information to give him. The investigation was new and incomplete, and no one wants to hear that their spouse had another life, so I kept the details sparse. I believe, Mr. Stark, that Liza knew her killer. That's why I want to know more about the life you 2 shared. I know that random killings are rare, but I don't think we knew the killer, Mrs. Wilcox, Carson replied, before offering me a beverage. I could see that he wasn't ready to believe that Liza could possibly have known someone he didn't. I was going to need a new angle. What do you take? Beer, wine, cognac? Come into the bar. I'll make some martinis, he said before I could answer. I followed him through a huge family room with a cathedral ceiling. We stopped when we reached the living room, and he waved me over to a large, beige leather sectional opposite a winding staircase, before he headed behind the rather sizable bar tucked into the corner of the room. A warm fire crackled on one wall, and adjacent to that, a theater-sized plasma television played a 24-hour news station without sound. I just read the ticker. Can't stand what they have to say, Carson said, as he motioned to the television before he began making the drinks. I noticed that he had not waited to hear what I'd like to drink, or even if I wanted a drink. Type A personality. Not open to suggestions? That was common among surgeons, and while being anal was a great quality during surgery, it rarely went over well in a marriage. What would it be like to be married to him? I decided to stop him before he went too far. "Mr. Stark, it's a little early for me, and I'm working so I won't be able to have a drink." "Oh. Yeah, I guess it is early for you. I just got off work a few hours ago. Sorry. My schedule gets mixed up." "Move over by the fireplace, it's nice," he said. Carson handed me a goblet filled with water. I took the glass and watched him take a long sip of his martini. "You really think Liza knew the killer?" "It's hard for me to believe that. I mean, we had a good life here. She was a great mom. Taught middle school for a year. Then when we had kids, she wanted to stay home to take care of them. We were happy. The cops were big on the infidelity angle. It simply isn't true. We were so very happy." I looked at the photos on the mantel. There was photo after photo of the family. The housekeeper was in a few, but Madeline Price, the woman in the photo Carson had showed me at the office, was also in 2 of the pictures. Her lips were pursed into a tight line that seemed to serve as her version of a smile. Only family members, the housekeeper and Madeline, Liza's brother, was nowhere to be seen. Her parents and Carson's parents were also absent. Strange. "Is that Liza's friend, Madeline Price?" I asked, interrupting Carson's stream of denial. "Yeah, Liza's best friend and yoga teacher." Madeline was the last person to speak to Liza. I'd left her a message the day before, but she had not called back. I made a mental note to try to reach her as soon as I left Carson's house. Madeline had made the family mantle. Obviously, she was important to the entire family. Which came first? The friendship or the yoga instruction? Oh, definitely the friendship. I mean, Liza loved yoga, but she wasn't into the whole lifestyle like Madeline is. I looked around the expensive house of excess and imagined that Liza had been far from a yogi. Would you say they were best friends? Carson sipped his martini, gave me a bewildered look, and muttered, "Liza was my best friend, we were very close. But outside of our marriage, yes, Madeline was her closest friend." "She lives in Ann Arbor, right?" "Correct. Not too far from your office. You should talk with her, but I know she didn't have anything to do with Liza's murder. I hope you aren't thinking along those lines." Carson was agitated. I tried to decipher whether this was his usual temperament, or if he was just overwhelmed with rekindled grief. For me to know who Liza was, I have to meet the people she spent time with. That's all. I have her parents and brother on my list as well. Carson rolled his eyes and took a long swig of his martini. "Peter is a total fuck-up. We rarely saw him because he's a drunk. It's loud and mean when things don't go his way. Abigail, his wife, rather ex-wife now, is kind. I hope she'll talk to you. She and Liza were somewhat close. I will get in touch with Abigail. Is there anyone else you think I should speak with?" Carson took a sip of his martini. "I can't think of anyone else. May I speak with Amelia?" "Sure, but she's the housekeeper. Do you think she'll have something worthwhile to share?" "I won't know until I speak with her. Sometimes people don't even realize that what they know is important. I just want to be thorough." "Of course. Thank you. I like thorough. I'll take the kids and you can speak with her." Carson seemed slightly bothered by the fact that I wanted to speak with the housekeeper, but he spoke to Amelia in Spanish and called the kids to his side. They followed him into another room, and I went into the kitchen. "Hola, señora," I said, holding out my hand. Amelia hesitated at first, but then relented and shook my hand. "Hello, Mrs. Wilcox," Amelia responded with a shy smile. "Is it okay if I ask you some questions?" Yes. It's okay. Sit, please." Amelia motioned towards the table. We both sat down. "I am trying to find out who killed Mrs. Stark. I know you had only begun working for her a few weeks before her death, but I would like to hear about your relationship with her. What can you tell me about Mrs. Stark? Are you Policia?" No. I am a civilian, a regular citizen who looks into crimes on my own. Like, what do they call it? Freelancer? Yes. That's exactly it. I am a freelancer. Okay. Well, I can tell you that Mrs. Stark very nice all the time, but sometimes she nervous about things. How did you know she was nervous? She having quiet phone calls, and when this lady come to the door she tell me not to answer. She answer herself. So, you usually answer the door, but she answered the door for one visitor? Yes. Small lady. She knock on door and give Mrs. Stark a note. That was the day before she die. I never see the lady before. Was Mrs. Stark nervous or angry, happy or friendly when this lady showed up? Nervous. The lady was using a tough voice. Not sure what she say, but it not look good. Would you mind describing her to me? What did she look like? Short, black, a little big. I wrote down the details. So, a woman had shown up at Liza's door the day before she was murdered. She spoke in a mean voice, and she wasn't someone the housekeeper recognized. Not exactly a lead. Had you seen this woman before? Do you think she was a salesperson, or someone trying to talk to Liza about religion? No. I never see her before, but Mrs. Stark see her before. Why do you think that? Because she knew her before she go to the door. She tell me, hold on, when the lady was walking to the door. And she not ask who it was. Mrs. Stark always answer the door when she know the people. Okay. So you usually answer the door, unless Mrs. Stark knows the person, correct? Yes. Unless she tell me no. Mrs. Stark told you not to answer the door? Yes. She say, no Amelia, I got it, and she do this to me. Amelia demonstrated by flapping her hand in a dismissive manner. Anything else you can tell me about the woman? She not have a car. No car in front of house. Strange. You needed a car to get around Northville Township. If you didn't have a car, you were catching a ride with someone. The public transportation system didn't stretch too far into the suburbs. That's all I know. Did you tell the police about this? Amelia rubbed her hands together and waited before answering. They never talked to me. Am I the first person to ask you questions about Mrs. Stark? Yes. No one talked to me. If they talk to me, I tell them. Is there anything else you can tell me about Mrs. Stark? No. Just that she was nervous a lot. Okay. Thank you. I appreciate you taking the time to speak with me. Amelia nodded, pushed back from the table, and headed back toward the living room where Carson was with the kids. A short black woman with a little bit of extra weight, without a car, came to the door the day before Liza was murdered. It wasn't much, but it was something. Now it was time to get a look at the murder book. I met Charles Kettering when I was 5 years old. We crossed paths for the first time on a day when my twin brother fell off his bike and scraped his knee. While I was comforting my brother and helping him up, a burly kid with a thick, low-cut afro came our way. He all right? The large boy asked in a soft voice. Yeah. He just took the turn wrong, I said, wiping tears from Simon's cheek. I was 4 minutes older than my brother, but as we aged, the minutes seemed more like years. Can you walk the bike back to our house? Yeah, Charles said. I turned back to Simon and took his hand. As soon as we started walking, Charles zoomed past me on Simon's bike. Hey. You can't ride the bike. I said, walk it back. I yelled, dragging Simon behind me as I ran toward Charles. When I caught up with him, I slugged him as hard as I could. He fell off the bike and started crying. All the commotion brought both sets of parents outside, where they found 2 sobbing boys and 1 bossy girl standing with her hands on her hips. Over 3 decades later, Charles and I were still friends. Charles was out when I arrived at the 8th precinct, but I was still able to get to the murder book. A few years ago, due to a major decline in population, Detroit decided to consolidate precincts. A lot of the guys I'd worked with at the 8th had been consolidated into what was briefly referred to as the Northwest Precinct. Now, after all the consolidating and reconfiguring, the new precinct was back to being the good old 8th. I walked through the double doors and spotted Daryl Anderson behind the call desk. Sylvia Wilcox, now what have us lowly folks done to earn the pleasure of your company? Daryl Anderson had transformed his natural snake oil salesman persona into a foundation for a successful career in law enforcement. He was the king of the interrogation room. He could go undercover and weave his way into just about any criminal operation. You know me. I only come around when I need something, I said, winking before slamming my hand into Daryl's thick palm and allowing him to pull me into a bro hug. How's Easy Street treating you? Daryl asked, referring to my private investigator status. Easier, and easier every day. We laughed and made small talk for a few minutes. After that, I chatted with a few other guys, high-fived my former boss, and then asked to see Detective Cole. He came strolling out of the back of the precinct with a suspicious smirk on his face. I held out my hand as he approached. Detective Cole. I'm Sylvia Wilcox, and I am. I know. Kettering already put a bug in my ear. Let's talk. Kelvin Cole was short and stocky with fuzzy but well-kept mutton chops bordering his upper lip. His eyes were sharp and dark, and they stood in stark contrast to his light brown skin. I hate to have people in my business, Cole said, gripping my hand tightly. Understandable. Thanks for talking with me. He was around 5'6", attractive, and based on the fact that he was the only guy with his nose in a file when I arrived, probably a good cop. I could tell by his swagger and laid-back sense of humor that he'd probably been born and raised in Detroit. A brief chat with my old chief had informed me that Cole was known for being a solid family man, and was already approaching high solve rates, even though he'd only been a detective for 4 years. How's the case? He asked, flipping through the murder book. I tried to catch a glimpse of the information as the pages turned. Murder books are great resources because they contain pictures, notes, and information from interviews, but from what I could see, this one didn't contain much. It's not moving as fast as I would like it to, but there are some leads. Really? Well, that's good. So you've chosen the pie thing. How's it working out? I thought about the large sums of money I'd collected from spouses, eager to know if their significant others were cheating on them. One case could net enough money to sustain me for several months, and if the information helped the victim get a nice divorce settlement, they were gracious and paid me even more. When I decided to become a pie, I hadn't considered the financial gains. At the time, I didn't want to be part of the police force. I was bitter, and blamed the DPD for Derek's death. Eventually it was revealed that Derek's death was not the fault of the department, but I still chose not to return from my leave of absence. After the first few cases as a private detective, I realized that my income was going to increase by leaps and bounds. Things are good. Of course, this murder case will be tough, but I think we can solve it. We're just missing something. We need a piece of evidence that isn't there. What do you think it is? No idea, but looking at the evidence might help. The evidence was sparse. The only items collected from the scene had been Liza's gold bracelet, her wedding ring, the carcass of a dead squirrel that had been underneath her body, and a bandana that she had stuffed into her purse. The bandana was the item that had made the police think she was having an affair. Brightmoor was known for its interesting blood and Crip spin-off gangs. Liza was suspected of seeing one of the gang members, and the bandana was thought to be a gift of some sort, or left behind because the killer was interrupted. The other thing that was curious about Liza's murder was the fact that the killer didn't take her jewelry, money, or vehicle. Instead, they shot her and left, perhaps in a panic, but maybe because they weren't interested in the money or the other items. This was very strange, and didn't support the cheater narrative. A man in Brightmoor could have supported himself for at least a year, with the amount of money and jewelry Liza had on her the day she was murdered. If he'd included the truck in the deal, he would have been set for more than a year. Something else was going on. No DNA? Nope. Nothing. The scene was clean. We're pretty sure she was killed there, as opposed to being dumped, but that means she was somewhere else that afternoon and evening. Somehow, she ended up in that alley. Lured there? Possibly. She was shot from the entrance of the alley, so she could have been lured there or chased. I read over the office's reports. It appeared that Liza hadn't gone into the party store, so that meant she had probably been meeting someone in the alley, or she had been taken into the alley and executed. The killer was familiar with the alley, and the ability to take a life while one was concealed there, so there was a good possibility that the person was from Brightmoor. I jotted down local on my notepad. How did you get her there? I murmured to myself. What would draw Liza to that area? Who was it? What was it? There was a footprint in the dirt near the body, Cole said. What size feet are we talking about? Smallish. The dude must be little. Really? Any photos of the print? Sure. The footprint was around a size 8 or smaller. This was exciting. If they had a shoe print, it would probably be easy to match it up with a shoe. What other evidence is there? There wasn't much, but there are a few insignificant things we gathered from the scene. The way that Liza was found, it was clear that she didn't fight back. She knew and trusted the person who killed her. It was a total surprise? Who would Liza trust? Her husband, of course, but there had to be others as well. The store owner called in the body, right? Yep. He didn't find her until 10 o'clock the next morning, but she had been there since the night before. He didn't take out the garbage until that time. The murder book said that Liza died between midnight and 3 a.m. What had she been up to before that time frame? If she was having an affair and things went wrong, that would explain the time of death. But since there was no proof of an affair, I had to think about other situations that might have occupied her time before she was murdered. Could she have been held somewhere before being taken to the alley and executed? What leads did you guys have? Virtually nothing. We didn't have much in the way of leads. That was part of the reason why we thought the cheating scenario might be the issue. The husband was difficult to deal with, and we had to consider him a suspect, but no one really thought he did it. It seemed like he loved the woman. He was pretty broken up over things. We hated him, but he wasn't a killer. Why did you hate him? He was rude, thought we owed him something, which we did, and we knew that, but he treated us like simple servants. Was always throwing big words in our faces, and getting all upset because we couldn't tell him why his wife was in the ghetto, or why she was murdered. He was never really a suspect. For a minute, but he was at work during the time that she was murdered, so there's no way that he did it. We thought about murder for hire, but the guy had no major motive. Liza didn't have any money, and they seemed to be happy, so there was no reason to get rid of her. Over time, we figured that we just didn't like him personally, but he wasn't a realistic suspect. Carson had been relatively easy to deal with, but he wasn't a warm and fuzzy guy. It was easy to imagine him clashing with DPD officers. I assume that you guys investigated the infidelity angle. Cole tilted his head to one side, as if he was formulating what he wanted to say. The boss wanted us to close the case fast. When we couldn't, we needed to cast suspicion on the victim. It wasn't right, and it wasn't what we wanted to do. That's part of the reason why I'm the only one here to talk to you. Corruption runs rampant in some precincts. There's no acceptable excuse, but the job breeds internal breakdowns. What happened to your partner? He was disgusted by the politics, one of those die-hard wanting to do the right thing kind of dudes. From what I hear, he was a lot like you, focused and grounded in morals and ethics that don't always fit in with the way we should do things. You know what I mean? I certainly did, and that was the reason why I had left the police force. He had been on the force for 10 years, but he started young, advanced quickly, and avoided politics for the most part. All his success was on merit, but this case, there was more to it. Things that were out of our control. Was there someone you thought might be a suspect, but couldn't investigate because you were rushed? No, it wasn't anything like that. The family was weird. Carson Stark. How so? Not her husband so much, but her parents and brother. The only person in that family that was any help was the sister-in-law. She said that Liza had a secret of some sort. She'd been meeting with some dude, but the sister-in-law didn't think it was an affair. Interesting. This is the sister-in-law that recently divorced Liza's brother? I didn't know they got a divorce, but it doesn't surprise me. That guy was wound so tight. The sister-in-law thought there was something Liza was hiding. Yeah, and she was friendly, unlike the rest of them. You want a lead to chase? Contact the sister-in-law. Give me a feel for the family. How are they difficult? The Stark family is old money. The Abernathys are new money. Both families feel put out if you ask them uncomfortable questions. And because they are known for donating money to various charities and organizations in Detroit, including DPD, we had to be careful. Detective Cole used air quotes and rolled his eyes. What does careful mean? I asked. This is what got Archie. We wanted to dig into the backgrounds of the two families. Thought it might be good to talk to everyone, you know? In-laws, siblings, everybody. Well, we kept leaving messages for the Starks and for Liza's parents, but they wouldn't call us back. Eventually, we stopped by their office in Plymouth and the receptionist had a fit. She told us they weren't in the office that day, so we left. The next day, Arch had a sticky note on his desk. Cease and desist? That's right. No explanation or reason. It just said that the Starks were irrelevant to the case. Of course, we argued that we couldn't say that until we talked with them, but the boss told us to tone it down and leave them alone. Arch got real mad, went to their house one day when he was off. He shouldn't have done it that way, but he had the right idea. He got written up, but we continued to try to pursue the case. We both decided to move forward with it, and we both became a lot less popular here at the precinct, but it was worth it. We thought we might be on to something. Were you? Maybe, but we were stonewalled. We weren't ready to give up. Instead, we switched to the Abernathys. Once again, we tried to schedule meetings, but they refused to meet. The mom sent us an email that said, no comment. No comment on their daughter's murder. Seemed weird, but after contacting them a few times, we received a similar message on a sticky note. Did you challenge the idea that you couldn't interview people who were relevant to the case? Yep. That's why Archie is now a hippie organic farmer out west. We challenged and they fought back. Eventually, some rumor conveniently got started about infidelity. The media was beating down our door, and the boss wanted results. When we couldn't get cooperation from either family, and it was clear that they hated one another, we were encouraged to let the rumor fester and take off. No one cares about a woman who cheats. We were pissed, but since we were told to leave it alone yet again, we had to drop it. Where did the rumor come from? Ironically, it was started during an interview with the chief. He threw it out there as a possible scenario. The media loved that angle, and they ran with it. It was a plant. I can't confirm or deny, but it was strange that he would give them that bone to chew on. You know the media loves drama. After Chief threw it out there, it was a part of every news story. Why did the chief start the rumor? Why wouldn't the Abernathys or Starks talk with police? I wondered if Carson would be able to get his parents to meet with me. Perhaps I could work through the friendly sister-in-law to get to Liza's parents. They were definitely on my list of people to interview. Any theories on why this needed to be a cover-up? Not really. The Stark and Abernathy families have donated a lot of money and time to the city of Detroit. Usually that means that there's a push to solve the case, unless there is a possible scandal. If Liza Stark was having an affair with a lowlife, it would have shamed the family. Maybe they knew that was going on, figured she was offed by a drug dealer and didn't want that to tarnish their reputation. It does tarnish the reputation a bit. Loose morals daughter throws it all away for drug dealer boyfriend. But it's just a rumor, pure speculation at this point. It's better for the public to think that, than for it to be proven. It also takes the pressure off DPD, which is an interesting angle, but I'm sure that figured into the chief's speculation. I'm sure. Hey, what about surveillance videos? Did you guys collect anything from the store? Yeah, but there wasn't anything on them. They were low quality, and they were focused on the front door and the back of the building. Unfortunately, you can't see anything on the tapes. It's like nothing happened that night. The angles were intensely focused on the store, which makes sense, especially in that area. What about the gang angle? Ali Mansu, the store owner, said that the gangs were harassing him before Liza's body was found, but they haven't bothered him since then. Was there any evidence that pointed towards gang involvement? No. It was strange that the attack stopped after that, but I think that has more to do with what Mansu did after that. What did he do? He took a stand for the neighborhood. Instead of leaving or bad-mouthing the place, he really stood up for the community. I think he earned street cred, and that's why they left him alone. Interesting angle. I know they're gang members, but they have Brightmoor pride in a way. To see someone stick up for their hood makes them feel good. I nodded, but in the back of my mind, I thought there had to be more to it than that. Interesting. Thanks for your time and insider's view. Dinner is on me one of these nights. Don't make promises you can't keep. For real. Dinner. Hey, can I get Archie's number from you? Cole hesitated. Give me a chance to talk to him. I'll give him your number and he can call if he wants. Fair enough. Okay, think about dinner. You pick the place and I'll spend the night picking your brain. Deal. We shook hands and I headed for the car.